Wow. Thank you, choir. Thank you, Misa. Thank you, John. Well, beloved, if you haven't gathered already, today we are celebrating Easter. For many Unitarian Universalists, including Christian UUs like me, we don't tend to believe in a literal resurrection of Jesus. And so why celebrate Easter? I ask this nearly every year, especially as so much now in popularized Christianity often seems antithetical to the heart of how I understand Jesus' life message. But this year I'm feeling a little different, and I'd like to tell you why. It started just about a week ago when Mr. Walters from DCP&P, that's the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, or foster care as some people know it, Mr. Walters gave us a call. Now, something you must know about Mr. Walters. Whenever he calls, it's usually with some extraordinary situation that is going to completely upend our lives as resource families. And he has a voice almost exactly like Barry White, which makes it very difficult to say no to Mr. Walters. He is well suited for his job. He began in the same way which he always begins when he calls me, Reverend, how are you today? He went on to explain that there was a baby boy who was just about 2.5 months old, and he was not thriving. In fact, he was not gaining weight. Would we consider being an emergency temporary placement for this little boy? It might be, he said, a few weeks while we work out some situations with the family to get him reunited. They were worried that something was going on in the foster home that he had been in for almost his entire life. We talked it over as a family. We called a family meeting, which is our practice. We discussed, and then we took a vote as good Unitarian Universalists. And this time it was Ella who was very excited, my daughter, who convinced Elias, who was a strong maybe, to turn his vote into a yes. We called back. Mr. Walters, we are a go. 3 days later, he arrived. And honestly, beloved, I have never felt so nervous about any placement we have had in our entire experience as a foster family. This little baby weighed just barely 9 pounds at 2 months and 3 weeks. He was clearly malnourished. His hands were bound up in clenched fists that he did not release. His skin had a grayish pallor to it, and his eyes were sunken in. And what I noticed most was that he was so quiet, too quiet. And that's when I got nervous, and looking him over, I looked at the caseworker and I said, "Are you sure he doesn't need to be in a hospital?" The caseworker looked at me as if she had wondered the same thing. "We just came from the pediatrician. He's going to go back in 3 days. And if he hasn't gained any weight in those 3 days, he will go into the hospital. If anything changes, call me immediately." So we said yes. And I sent out the signal that foster parents send out to the neighborhood, then to the kindergarten chat, then to the 4th grade mom's WhatsApp thread. The replies came in quickly. "I've got a baby bath. I have a bassinet. I can come hold him for a few hours. Do you need bottles? I have glass ones." Yes, 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 and yes, we said. His muscles were so tense from malnourishment that he was able to flip on his belly, which he shouldn't be able to do at his age. That night, I spent every minute listening for his breathing. And about every 2 hours, he woke up hungry again. By Wednesday morning, Anne-Marie, my spouse, and I were a little bleary-eyed. Anybody remember those times? Anybody have this experience? And honestly, that Wednesday morning, we weren't sure if this placement was a good idea, if it was the right decision. But sometimes you just have to look at something twice to understand it. Take the Christian story. For most people today, the dominant image of Christianity is what? The cross. That'd be wonderful if it was. As theologians and historians Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker remind us, though, in Saving Paradise, the cross was not always the dominant symbol of Christianity. In fact, images of Jesus' corpse took nearly 1,000 years after his death to appear. After studying early Christian art, they concluded the most common image was paradise. The 4-streamed garden overflowing with beauty and peace that is described in Genesis and is drawn from Sumerian and Persian influences. In the setting in which the early Christian movements derived their understanding of paradise, there was one element that was so central. One element. What do you think that was? Anyone know? This is a participatory day. If you're looking for the non-participatory Easter, it's not going to be me today. What do you think it is? Water, yes. And this is why we told you today the story of Jesus' baptism. I know some of y'all were like, do they not know what the story of Easter's about? Why are they starting with Jesus' baptism? The baptism, you understand, took on central meaning in the early Christian church and its core to the entire Easter story for those early Jesus followers. Because the baptism signified that Jesus was the embodiment of God's breath and life force, and by consequence, Jesus' entire life and ministry made it possible for paradise to be here on earth. We were no longer cast out from paradise, separated from the garden. The early Christian community believed that Jesus' life made paradise present here on earth. Now, paradise probably feels a little otherworldly. And I have to say that Wednesday morning, I wasn't feeling a lot of paradise. It might even be hard for some of us to imagine something as big as paradise. In our covenant, we have a pledge to daily acts of liberation. And there are so many members who have come to me and said, really? Like every day I'm going to experience liberation? Really, Robin? Paradise in the here and now? Have you been listening to the news? A lot of us are feeling deeply in the tomb right now. At the very least, in the slog of the daily, it might be hard to imagine paradise in the present moment. That Wednesday morning, I couldn't imagine why we had said yes. But we kept on, because that's what you do, right? Weeds in concrete, my grandpa used to say. Be weeds in concrete. At first, we didn't see many changes in this every 2-hour feeding schedule, his fists still clenched. And then, almost as if by magic, a little over a day after arriving to our doorstep, those little fists that had not opened released. It was more mystical than a stone rolling away from a tomb. It was more amazing than a dove sweeping in at a baptism. And then he smiled. And you can't tell me paradise isn't possible here on earth when you see an infant smile. Soon he began eating more. 6 ounces to 7, then to 8. I felt like I was in March Madness watching the 2 final teams play the game. We returned to the pediatrician who applauded us that in 3 days he had gained 9 ounces. And I wondered, can we beat it the next time we come? I'm nothing if not competitive. Now, I know some of you are skipping ahead to this plot, right? Because you're wondering, well, he's only going to be with you for a little while. I know how this story will end. But you see, if you believe paradise is in the present moment, if you can believe that life can emerge from seeming death, then you know it's not only the end of the story that matters, it's the plot all the way to it. Let me say that again. It's not only the end of the story that matters. It doesn't have to be wrapped up in a bow. In fact, we don't have to even know the end, because if paradise is present in every single moment, it's the entire plot that matters. You know, the story of Jesus is much like this one. It's an invitation to live in the paradise now, to cultivate it, and in so doing to defy death. And you might rightfully be wondering, but Robin, didn't the crucifixion end all that? Sure, paradise sounds lovely, but the truth is Jesus' life ended in a brutal death. Yes, crucifixion was a capital punishment inflicted by Roman authorities. It was the worst kind of punishment because it didn't require a trial. It was reserved for those who were enslaved or seen as having no basic human rights, not even a right to a trial. And so I'm getting a gift, an Easter gift. Oh my, thank you, Ariana. Wow. Happy Easter. It's hard to follow that. And so it was a crime where you didn't even have a trial. You didn't even have a right to your voice, a right to defend yourself. It was a shaming punishment. It was a punishment that was not only brutal in its act, but also designed to squash any movement that was trying to resist the injustice of Roman authority. As Brock and Parker note in their work, the Passion narratives broke silence about the shame and fear that crucifixion instilled. To lament was to claim powers that crucifixion was designed to destroy. Dignity, courage, love, creativity, and truth-telling. In the telling of the story of Jesus' death, the gospel writers did something magnificently brilliant. No, they didn't center death in the middle of religion. No, they didn't aggrandize violence. No, they didn't intend to make the cross the central image of Christianity. No, what they did instead was ensured that Jesus' death was not the last chapter. In telling the story of that death, in telling that story, they defied it. They secured life. The early Christians, among them Unitarians and Universalists, were by and large a movement of bringing justice. Justice and healing, hope and community to those who were cast out, downtrodden, harassed by the government. It was why they were so unstoppable and ultimately one of the most powerful rulers in the world. An emperor had to convert. Why? Because if you can't beat them. Over the last week, smiles and baby coos started to emerge with this little one. The once gray pallor turned to a ruddy and warm brown-filled hue to his skin. 1 week later, we took him to the pediatrician to discover he'd gained another 11 ounces. That was 1 pound and 2 ounces in just a week, if you were counting. The doctor remarked, almost in disbelief, "He's a different baby. I've never seen him smile. Wow." And then I watched her as she just stopped and stared at him, and I realized her eyes were welling up with tears. And she kind of shook her head as if to pull herself together. And she said, "Okay, well then just keep doing what you're doing." And she went to leave the room, and I used a little bit of a pastoral care technique and asked her a question to keep her a minute longer. "Do you think," I said, "do you think it was just that he wasn't being fed enough?" "Maybe," But in my professional opinion, it's more than that. He is clearly being held and getting stimulation. It's all of it that helps a baby thrive. It's everything in the living environment. And then as the crying pediatrician left the room with joy, I found myself holding this temporary placement of paradise in my arms. It's then that I remembered. I remembered why we celebrate Easter. The poet Wendell Berry teaches that we have to practice resurrection every day, that it is always, beloved, a tomb time, and we can never just stay in the upper room crouched in fear of death and torture. We journey, he says, to the tomb. We go out into the community. We say yes when we are unsure if we will succeed, because a not trying is a kind of death. Paul taught this to the early Christians. He said that if they followed the way of Jesus, the way of turning over the tables to injustice, the way of loving thy neighbor, the way of inclusion, the way of love, that death would have no dominion over them. Now, obviously, Paul knew that crucifixion existed. Paul knew they could be tortured and maligned in all manner of ways, but Paul saw another kind of death that could be defeated, that was just as horrific. It was the death of giving up in the face of injustice. It was the death of saying, well, this is just the way the world has always been, and I guess it will always be. It was the death of not trying. Amen? It was the death of saying, yeah, you're right, some people don't deserve full humanity. Yeah, you're right, the sick should be put outside the city walls. Yeah, you're right, some people just spend their whole lives in the cold and poor because you're right, we don't have enough. To that, Paul said, no, death shall have no dominion. And so today, beloved, we journey, yes, to the tomb. We go out into the community. We say yes when we're unsure. We come together in community even if you really wanted to build a blanket fort and stay alone. And in the face of persecution of beloveds, whether for gender or culture or religion or simply place and time of birth, in the face of fear and threat, we, like that early Christian community, declare, here, death has no dominion over us. For as Reverend Victoria Weinstein reminds us, the stone has got to be rolled back from the tomb again and again every year. So roll up your sleeves. He's not coming back, you know. He is not coming back unless it is we who rise for him. We who lay healing hands on the reviled and the rejected like he did on his behalf. We who rage for righteousness in his insistent voice. Because if by some miracle, and hey, why not a miracle, he did come back, wouldn't he want to see us like this? Wouldn't it be a miracle to live for just one day so that if he did by some amazing feat come riding into town, he could take a look around and say, this is what I meant. Amen. And we could say, it took us a long time, but we finally got it figured out. Oh, let us live to make it so. You are the resurrection and the life. Death has no dominion here, beloved. We've been baptized by the bruises. We've been baptized by the beautiful and the unbelievable. We are resurrected with the courage to raise our love, with a resistance to injustice, and with a head unbowed and a heart radiant. Death has no dominion, not in the denial of humanity or the damn harshness of this defeat, because you are held in this community, blessed by waters you did not create. You are the resurrection and the life, and paradise is here already, beloved. And what can we say in the face of that paradise? as it smiles and releases its hand like doves. But alleluia, 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 alleluia.